Wonderful. So welcome everyone to Temple Beth El. We're grateful that we can be together remotely on this winter evening. We're grateful to partner with our friends at the Jewish Alliance to bring you this programming. And we're very, very excited to have Mimi with us. But I am first going to introduce the co-chairs of our Pride team, Jay Potter, and Jody. And Jay is going to introduce Mimi this evening. So Jay, go right ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to have you here tonight, and I just want to introduce you to my good friend and the author of the book that we're talking about tonight, Mimi Lemay. She is an international advocate for trans youth and the author of the viral essay, A Letter to My Son Jacob, on his 5th birthday. She meets regularly with legislators, business leaders, educators, and clergy to share her vision of a more equitable world. She is a member of the Parents for Trans Equality National Council at the Human Rights Campaign and holds a Master in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. But what I know most about Mimi is that she's an amazing mom of a trans son. She's a fierce advocate for my community, and we are very, very blessed to have her here tonight.
Thank you, Jay. I am just so delighted to be here, being able to speak to an audience that includes a good friend of mine is such a pleasure. And Jay, likewise, I met Jay about 4 or 5 years ago. We went to a conference. We attended the same conference, and I think Jay was working in the conference, helping transgender youth in a variety of ways and teaching parents how to be better parents. So if we are good parents, if I am a good parent, it is partly due to you. So thank you so much. And he has the cutest dogs, and so I stalk his puppies on Facebook as well. So that's another connection we have. I'm delighted to be here tonight. It's very important for me to be speaking with faith communities, in particular communities the same, the faith that I grew up in, that I'm able to share some of my own journey through maybe a different kind of Judaism growing up with, to come to the place where I not only feel it is the right thing to do to support my son, but I feel that in many ways, he provides for me a very profound understanding of my own humanity and my own spirituality. So I'm delighted to be here tonight. And Jay, do you want to start with questions? Do you have a particular set of things that you want to ask me, and we can go from there and then take audience questions, or how are we going to do it?
So if you want to just start just with Jacob's story, how you, I really love kind of like how Jacob came into his own, but how you also came into your own during the process. Maybe just share a little bit of how you came to write your book, what motivated you to write your book, and how you feel about that now. Yeah, that'd just be a great start. Just an overall intro would be awesome.
Thank you. So when I was raised in a very ultra Orthodox Jewish community, probably pretty dissimilar from the congregation that I'm speaking with now, because we didn't have access to, well, we didn't have the internet when I was a kid anyway. I'm 44, but if there had been more access to the internet, we wouldn't have had it, and we didn't. I was raised in a community where primarily people didn't read secular literature or read the newspapers. And I was a little bit different because my mother was a single mom, which was, again, in this ultra Orthodox community that I was raised in New York, was kind of an anomaly back then. But also she had been educated in secular schools, even had a PhD. So I lived in a world where I was straddling, I knew a lot about the outside world, but I didn't have a lot of access to it. And in my community, as a woman in this role of being a young girl growing up, the expectation was that most primarily the way I felt it was an expectation of a certain kind of modesty, not only in the way I dressed and looked, but also the way I interacted with the world and interacted with especially people of the opposite sex. And the understanding was that I would be demure and quiet and less involved in outwardly facing public roles. And this was something that was brought home time and again in my education. There were passages of the Psalms that were read uh, frequently to young women that said we were like, flowers or resting in the shade of a tree. We needed to stay in the shade. We needed to stay in the shadows. It was not modest for us to take a more public role in our communities. And as a young girl, I was very intellectually curious. And after I'd say like when I was 13 or 14 years old, I had a little bit of a rebellious phase that included, sneaking out of the house to see my first rated R movie, and wearing that skirt that was maybe just an inch below my knee. But I soon got over that. I went to a high school where I really developed a love for Torah learning, the learning of the Hebrew Bible, and because it was a more modern Orthodox high school, when I got to seminary, I didn't realize that this would be yanked away from me, that I would be told that I only had a few years left to devote to learning, and then marriage, between the ages of 18, 19, 20, that was the expectation. And after that, to take care of the home and the children. And I'm going to quote verbatim, I was to shoo my husband out of the house so that he could learn and take care of the earthly needs. But don't worry about it, because it would all even out when we got to heaven, because, I would be rewarded for supporting his learning. But I was the one who wanted to learn. And this hurt so deeply that it began to fray at the whole system that, I'd been raised to believe in. And I came to the conclusion that I didn't fit in this world, not because there was something wrong. At the time, I never completely questioned the rightness of what I was being told. I didn't know of another Judaism, really. But I began to see myself as somehow different, warped, wrong, because I was not able to be happy with the way God made me. And, and I was told that this is how God made you as a woman. And things kind of reached a bit of a head when I had an arranged engagement at the age of 20 that was called off about a month before the wedding. And I write about it in the book. And I should probably pick up the book so you can kind of see the cover and the title, but it's called What We Will Become. And after the engagement was broken, it was the beginning of my path to freedom, because I truly realized that I could not thrive in this world, and that slowly, in its own way, this world was killing me. And I left at the age of 22 this community and came to Boston on my own, but with my mother's, having wrestled my mother's blessing, tepid blessing, tenuous blessing from her. Came to college, went to BU, and then finally to Tufts. Met my non-Jewish husband, who's not really affiliated with his own family's faith, which is Catholicism. We married. We had 3 kids, almost, in pretty quick succession when I was in my early 30s. And I thought I had left religion far behind. And I also thought I had left my struggles far behind, which is now from the vantage point of 44 years old, I think is a little bit of a ridiculous assumption, because life will throw you curveballs. And the curveball that came my way when my middle child was 2.5 years old is that disregarding what the doctor had told me was his gender when he was born, he came to us and said, "I am a boy." And at first it kind of just I would say, slipped up on us, and we didn't really take it seriously. It was play acting. Um, I didn't know anything about the word transgender or what it meant to be a transgender person or to have a gender identity that was different than one's sex assigned at birth. But after a couple of months of struggle with our middle child, um, and his increasing evident sadness and anger at being seen and thought of as a girl, which he knew he wasn't. And, as parents who didn't know much about this back in 2012, I know it sounds like it wasn't that long ago, but it was the Stone Ages when it came to understanding trans kids. Um, we didn't support him at first. We didn't, we didn't aggravate him. We didn't say, uh, we didn't pull any kind of demanding him to cease and desist, saying he was a boy, but we didn't support it either. And we said, you are a girl. Look, you have the same body parts as your sisters. But girls can be really cool too, and girls can play with trucks, and a lot of girls did amazing things with their lives. And I was just working on the assumption that maybe some gendering in preschool had made him unhappy with his gender. But one of those things that's remarkable about trans kids is that they frequently really persist in this identity. And if allowed, if given a chance to stake a claim and say who they are, they will continue to do that. And this again is not always the case, because sometimes they get shut down, sadly. But with my son, I think he had enough gumption and courage and doggone stubbornness that he continued to say, "No, you're really wrong. I'm a boy. No, I'm not pretending. I'm not pretending," he used to say. And he was very, very adamant about it. So after about, over a year of this persistence, parents finally woke up and said, "Oh my goodness, either something is terribly wrong with our child, and I'm sad to think that I ever thought that, or maybe there is some way that he is right about who he is." And that's when we began to really dig deep into the concept of what it meant to be transgender. And at the time, there weren't a lot of stories or examples of young kids. There were a few things out there on the internet. They weren't always easy to find. I actually didn't. Some of you have heard of Jazz Jennings. She's actually called into Family Fun Weekend, sometimes our conference, to be supportive of our kids and to give them a really fun little Zoom. But I had not come across her video, her interview with Barbara Walter, and all we had at this point of crisis with our family, because I said, "Oh, what is going on with my almost 4-year-old and 4-year-old child," was an example of a young boy out in California whose mother had made a slideshow. His name is Rylan, showing his transition from his assigned gender of a female to the boy that he always knew that he was. And seeing that really broke open this fear that I had been clinging to, that this can't be with a young child. They can't know who they are at this young age, and maybe we can delay this, and maybe if we just try hard enough to make him comfortable in his own skin, he'll kind of get over this in a matter of time. And I saw this kid who, before the transition, pre-transition, was clearly glum, just like my child, and very unhappy, and heard the words of his mother in this slideshow saying, "My child did not want to live this way." And I recognized that sadness and that darkness in my own child. And when the light came through, and this young boy just shone in his new, accepted as who he was, we said to ourselves, my husband and I, well, maybe this is something we can allow Jacob to do. And maybe seeing this video, he will have faith that he can also, come to life and have a true and authentic existence and be happy again. Because we knew he wasn't really happy. And that was very evident comparing him and his development to that of my other kids. And so at, the age of 4 and a quarter, a little bit over 4 years old, we showed him the video, and we said, what do you want? Do you want to continue with your old name in the old school? Or do you want to, we'll tell your teachers if you want to go with a new name and be known as a boy and use he, him, his pronouns. Or, we could take you somewhere new entirely. We can just start over. And that is what he chose. He said, I want to be a boy always, a boy named Jacob. And Jacob, he has been since that day back in 2015. He's now 10 years old, but on the cusp of 11. And he truly came to life after, being allowed to transition socially, which means, he cut his hair even shorter than it had been. He began to use the proper pronouns, which for him were he, him, his. And we used the name Jacob from that moment forward and referred to him and treated him like the boy that he is. And that was a turning point for him, absolutely, a turning point for us as a family, because we had been living, walking on eggshells with a child who was clearly unhappy for almost 2 years at that point. And it was wonderful to see him begin to be that 4-year-old that he should have been allowed to have been, that happy-go-lucky, engaged in the world, wanting to make friends, wanting to learn new things, curious about life, 4-year-old. And he continued to grow every year since. But to your question, Jay, because this is the longest winded answer you've ever gotten. How did I come to write the book? How did I come to start advocating? It became apparent within the months after Jacob's transition that we lived in a bit of a bubble here in Massachusetts with a supportive family, and supportive friends, because it clearly was not the case everywhere in this country. And we began to learn about some pretty horrifying statistics related to transgender people and non-binary people and how they were treated in our society and how the legal system did not protect them entirely. And especially when it came to transgender youth, we learned that a lot of people, many more people than we could ever have imagined, did not believe in the validity of a trans person's identity, and made these kids' lives miserable. And some of them had even been subjected to conversion therapy, which is, I put the therapy in quotation marks. It is not a therapy. It is an attempt to try to shame and coerce a young person away from their identity as either gay or their sexual orientation. Their sexual orientation is gay, or their identity is trans or non-binary or something other than cisgender, which is, identifying with their sex assigned at birth. And when we learned about the really high suicide rates and the harassment that transgender people went through, we realized that not only was Jacob less safe than we thought, because, he would go out into this world too, but so were so many other people, across this country, across the world, and that something needed to be done. And in particular, there was a young woman who took her life in December of 2014, which is shortly after Jacob's transition, and left a note to ask the adults in her life and in the world to fix this problem, to fix the way society was maltreating trans people and the oppression that they were undergoing. And I took that plea to heart. And I have attempted to fix it as much as I can. And I have to say, my first piece of advocacy was that letter to Jacob on his 5th birthday. That was something that I sat down and talked to Jacob about sharing. It was my contribution to maybe a little more understanding that young people can be transgender, and that as parents, allowing them to live their true selves was the best thing that you could do for them. And after that went viral, which, I was not social media savvy beforehand. Can't call myself social media savvy right now. But I was definitely not prepared for the kind of attention that piece brought our family. But, with a lot of prayers and a lot of hope, we began to speak out about trans kids and what the community needed from us, from people who weren't transgender, and the kind of support that needed to happen as quickly as possible. And shortly after the letter, I got some interest from the publishing world, and sitting down with my family, talking about the kind of project this would we would be undertaking. We decided to go for it and to have me write this book. And when I sat down to begin to write it, after about 6 months of just staring at the screen and doing everything else, there was a lot of laundry that got done those days, a lot of procrastinating of every kind, and a lot of imposter syndrome. I finally sat down and began to write, and my concept was that I didn't want to just tell the story of raising Jacob and discovering that he was transgender, but that it was important to show a parallel story of where I'd come from in ultra Orthodox Judaism, the kind of things that had been said to me about my role in life based on my gender, and how incorrect they had been. And if I hadn't followed my own heart, if I hadn't left this community, I would never have lived a free and full life that I am now. And I thought if people could appreciate that part of the story, then maybe they could appreciate why I would, allow a 4-year-old to transition. And the way those two stories wove together and brought something really beautiful at the end of the book, I think, in regards to my own Judaism, felt like also a very important thing to say. And, where I left you when I was talking about my Judaism is that I was rather bitter about it. I had left my community. I had gone and to Boston on my own. I had married, I would call him a lapsed Catholic. Not that he was ever unlapsed, but, I still strongly believed in the God of my youth. And so to me, because that's who he was, it was such a patriarchal concept of God. He had created me in a way which was untenable, making me making me a creature that could not be happy in my own skin as a woman in the faith. And so I felt that in some way he had set up my own expulsion from this community, my leaving. And I thought he wanted to have nothing to do with me. But when Jacob became Jacob, I had this moment, this blinding moment of that's interesting that I use the word blinding, but this earth-shattering moment of clarity that if I had stayed in this community and been given this child, he would never have survived. He would never have been recognized for who he is. He would never have been validated. He might have been one of those horrific statistics. And so this precious child who was given to me, this beautiful soul, I needed to leave in order to be worthy of him, to be able to be the mother he needed me to be. And so in that moment, my own narrative of my history kind of flipped on its head. And I realized that possibly this was meant to be all along, and that I had been guided out of this community. And that feeling of that presence that had always been there, though I had kind of denied it, was one of the most spiritual moments of my life. And I've carried that with me. And when I speak to faith communities, I speak with the assurance that my child is a miracle. He is meant to be who he is. And we, as a faith community, must stand up for people like him. because if there is anyone who can teach you about Tselem Elohim, about God's nature being unique in so many different aspects, incorporating different genders, about the growth of the human spirit and the potential of the human spirit, it is a person like Jacob. It is a person like Jay. And I think that it is our duty as a faith community, as a spiritual community, to make sure that we protect the spirit that wants to thrive despite the oppression, which is what transgender people have been experiencing. So I am delighted to be here. I've come to the end of a very long question. And now we can give me another one. It'll be shorter this time.
That was a great answer. I always love hearing your story, especially, when you speak to like Jacob coming out of his shell, you just light up, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful to see it, because so many of the kids that I mentor don't have that support in their families. So when we see, especially when I see, I was not supported as a child. So when I see it and it's recognized, it's a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
So I think my second question is coming from an ultra Orthodox perspective, and now still, I'm assuming, practicing some today. What do you say to those families that are trying to reconcile the difference between having a faith community that is unsupportive and just like the wrestle that a lot of people have between their faith and having a trans child?
Yeah. It's a particularly tough discussion to have within the ultra Orthodox community, because the way that rabbinical Judaism is followed in the ultra Orthodox communities, it's absolute, and even though authority to come up with new understandings of the rabbinical law is given to some of the highest levels of rabbis in this community, it does not the way that I was taught to look at things when I was younger is that if something doesn't make sense, it has to fit in to what I know about the Torah and what I know about rabbinical Judaism, as opposed to vice versa, that I'm looking at a phenomenon, I'm looking at something, science, somebody who doesn't fit into my my understanding of the world, like a transgender person, rather than seeing the reality of what I'm seeing in front of me, I would be taught to say, well, that's an aberration, and that has to fit into the way I've been taught. And unfortunately, the transition to looking with new eyes at modern world problems has not penetrated in the ultra Orthodox community when it comes to LGBTQ people. They've managed to find ways to get, lights to turn on the Sabbath by themselves and other things, but they have not come to that acceptance. And so the conversation with an ultra Orthodox Jewish person has to come down to, what you are seeing is just to speak to the parent's heart, to say your child is failing spiritually, not failing as in they did something wrong, but in the old fashioned sense of someone is failing. They are spiritually falling and diminishing right before your eyes because they can't live the life they're meant to lead. Like, you can see that they're not okay being forced to live as the gender that they know that they're not. And so we have here a situation of pikuach nefesh, which is the obligation that any Jew has to supersede rabbinical law, the law of the world, the secular law, in order to save a life. And I think there's plenty of evidence that transgender children who are not supported do not do well, and they are a very high risk. So if we can reach a parent's understanding that their child will not do well without their support, sometimes that's the way in. But I have known people, and I think you know some of the same people, who have had to leave their communities in order to support their child. I have yet to know a genuinely ultra orthodox community who will tolerate and accept a transgender person, and that is really sad. I know of rabbis who have left the community and are still ultra orthodox, and they now are spreading messages of positivity and acceptance in their congregations, but their congregations are not part of the ultra orthodox. So this is that was a really tough question. But in terms of kind of more modern Orthodox that have already made attempts to integrate, to synthesize with the modern world, it is an easier discussion. It's not an easy one, but it's an easier one. And, you're able to point to the fact that sometimes literal interpretations of the Bible have been shown to not be applicable. We are able to supersede some of the more, literal fundamentalist thinking about the Torah in order to live modern lives. To go to, a lot of people from the modern Orthodox communities will go to college, and they will work in secular settings, and they make it work. And they use dispensations. And in the same case, they may be more exposed to individuals who are LGBTQ and more able to say, you're able to say, these people live among us. They are worthy of your respect and your appreciation as valued community members. And this is going to require of you to be more supportive. And I think the argument gets stronger the further away you are from very reactionary rabbinical Judaism.
Awesome.
But if that in any way that, if you have a question about that, come back to me.
So at this time, I'm going to open up to questions. So feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box for Mimi or myself. I just want to encourage people, if you're worried about the wording of your question or maybe not sounding like you don't know what you're talking about, please, Mimi and myself have been presenting for years. I promise you there's very, very little that you could put into that chat box that would surprise me, and her as well. So this is really just an open and affirming place for you to ask whatever you'd like, that we can use to create more clarity and just more acceptance within our own community for trans people.
There's questions in the chat box now, if you want to start with that.
Okay.
How did Jacob's siblings react to his transition? So, younger sibling was, Lucia was 2.5 at the time. And so for her, it was probably a few weeks of confusion. This is different, but there wasn't the sense of temporary loss that Jacob's older sibling did feel. Jacob's older sibling is 17 months older than him. And actually, I use the word sibling instead of sister because over the summer, Eli, older sibling who is now 12, has been thinking a lot about their own gender. And right now, for the moment, feels more non-binary, which means doesn't feel represented by either the strict male or female gender, assumptions. Let's put it that way. And so I use the they them pronouns. And so Eli, older sibling, had a rough time in the beginning and felt sad, felt like they were losing a sibling, a sister. But within a few weeks, saw so much joy and happiness and renewed possibilities of a good relationship with their brother that they really have been just a remarkable support for Jacob and became so close to Jacob. In fact, almost attached at the hip. and really continue to be such an advocate and speaking up too on on their own behalf for their younger brother. So it was really beautiful. All right. Let's see. Okay. Oh, okay. Yes. Julie, very tough question and good question. Um, there is, there are books out there that or theories that purport that the number of young people coming out as trans indicates that perhaps this is a trend, or in a very insulting way, one author decided to use the word craze, that it's a craze. And there's to answer that, and I know that you don't feel that way, but to answer the assumption that this is rapidly occurring in young people, and it's likewise not a serious thing, is only a phase. I think the term used by not by scientists, not by the medical establishment, but by people who are proponents of this theory that being transgender is not real, is called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And they point to people around the age of puberty who are coming out as trans and looking at friends and saying, well, I think I'm trans too. So the truth is that we don't know the exact number of trans people naturally occurring in our society, but we know it's a lot bigger than it had been in the past, or at least had been accounted for in the past, because trans people up until recent years have not really been allowed to live in our society as who they are and come out as trans. So if you're seeing a rise in the number of trans people that it is because finally they're able to come out, to talk about their experiences, to transition as adults. And this is also affecting the ability of younger people to transition because they have role models, they have vocabulary for what it means to be trans. And if you talk to trans adults, and I'll let Jay talk to this, his own experience, but many of them knew who they were from around the age of my son, who knew who he was very young age, 2, 3, 4 years old, or frequently when puberty comes along, they suddenly realize, not suddenly, they knew something was different about them, but then this really doesn't fit. This male puberty or this female puberty, now I really feel wrong. And that's sometimes a prompt for them to make that decision, to investigate why they feel so differently about themselves and to realize that they are trans. And so it is not a craze or a trend, but it is a positive thing that as a society, we are now enabling people to live authentically. We value authenticity. We have a medical establishment that is coming on board and speaking up for trans kids. And so you will see more transgender children. You will see people thinking about their gender identity that they may never have been allowed to before. So definitely not a craze. And the book that you referenced, Julie, it was written by a woman who has for many years been a source of attack on the trans community, and has been in league with a lot of people in both politicians and people in not supportive faith communities who have attempted to make sure that trans people are not allowed freedom in their communities. So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. Jay, do you have anything to add about that?
I don't, but I do have a couple questions that were sent to me directly. The first one is, how did your mother react to Jacob's transition? And then the second one is, are you practicing your faith now in an affirming congregation?
Great questions. So my mother, being still ultra Orthodox, had a tough time in the first, weeks and months after Jacob's transition. She had come to visit us. She was living in England. I was living in the US. But in her extended stays, she had seen Jacob, scream and cry that he was a boy, and, be angry because somebody, at home, we were calling him whatever that he wanted. We were trying to kind of pacify him for the longest time. And so she saw how unhappy he was when he wasn't respected in that way. And he didn't get to have that a boy's name used. So she saw the unhappiness, but her her framework, her religious understanding of the world did not allow for there being transgender people. So I think she went through a phase of confusion, concern. She was wondering if we were crazy and hopping on some kind of trend. But the proof was in the pudding. And in this case, the pudding was, a 4-year-old boy who had previously been so unhappy, not relating to people, not accepting hugs, not looking people in the eye, and suddenly became this kid who was so much happier, and engaged, and a delight to be around. So when a bubby sees that, I think that speaks for itself. And so within a 6 or 7 weeks, she was completely on board, despite being still holding on to her very strict religious tenets, with using the right name and the pronouns. And she's been supportive ever since. She's proud that the book was hard because a lot of it was about our difficult relationship growing up, but other than that, I think she's genuinely really proud that we are advocating. And I just wish it could filter back into the community that she came from. Oh, the second question. What was the second question?
Yes. Are you currently practicing your faith in an LGBTQIA affirming congregation?
So we don't go on a weekly basis, but when the kids are growing up, we attended the Melrose Temple in Melrose, Massachusetts. I forgot the name of it, but for like special high holidays and kids services for Passover and Hanukkah and things like that. And in our home, we don't keep the Sabbath or kosher, but we do celebrate, I would say, the major holidays in a way that I enjoy bringing back a lot of the values that I was raised with, but with a new reinterpretation, with an interpretation that fits the world that I want to live in and the way I believe spirituality should be practiced. And so, for example, on Passover, we'll do a Seder, an abbreviated Seder. We used to do Seders that would last until 2 a.m. They were a bit of a torture, especially that empty stomach, that first moment when the matzah hits the stomach and you get that horrible cramp. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but none of that. So we have an abbreviated Seder. We talk about the concepts of freedom and how that applies to our lives today and the lives of others. So we talk about the fact that there are still people in the world who are physically subjugated, live in slavery. And then there are other people who oppression has made it harder for them to make ends meet or to get health care. And in some ways, they are being held down, and it's a form of slavery. And we talk about addiction as being slavery as well. So we talk about things like that. So I try to make it relevant. And I find that it's very easy, in fact, to make so many of the beautiful lessons and stories and the holidays of the Jewish faith be remarkably relevant and very, very important as a guiding light for the best way to live in today's world too, which is wonderful. I've come full circle and I've reclaimed that.
Beautiful. The next question we have is, how will you handle puberty with Jacob?
It's a great question. So, and it's also an important point to make because Jay, I'm sure you know that across this country, transgender youth are facing some really dangerous legislation, anti-trans legislation in different parts of this country, including New Hampshire, so not too far from all of us, where their right to live as they are, to access life-affirming medical care, and to be part of their school community is being threatened. And these bills, these anti-trans bills, some of them are sports bills, some of them are called medicalization bills, are the next wave of anti-LGBTQ hate. that began with bills to prevent transgender people from using public spaces and going to the bathroom, and that failed. And to prevent gay people from getting married and having kids and adopting, and all those, that progression of the anti-LGBTQ legislation has now brought us to this point where it's the kids like Jacob, and especially young trans girls, in fact, who are being attacked in legislation. And so I think it's very important that everybody be educated on what kind of medical, um, affirmative medical interventions are appropriate for trans kids, and which are just a fantasy created by conservative media and certain anti-LGBTQ legislators. So when a trans boy, for example, so someone who is sex assigned at birth female, so female reproductive organs, reaches puberty, it is at that point that they have an option, working with an endocrinologist, working with a medical team, parents, members of their inner circle, to pause puberty, because to have the puberty that is not fitting for them can be a trigger to the kind of depression and anxiety and the kind of harassment from the outside that can come to them, because their appearance will begin to change and they'll start to look as something that they know they're not. And so that is the moment where it is appropriate for a decision to be made, if the young person wants that, to pause puberty, so that they have more time to consider and think about what they want to do next, and not have to go through the puberty that can be so very emotionally and physically painful for them if they have gender dysphoria, which is the sense of the inappropriateness of some physical aspects to who they know they are, which can be incredibly painful. It is not just mental; it can just affect a young person in a very intense way and be debilitating. So that moment of pausing with a puberty blocker at the onset of puberty, it's timed perfectly. A endocrinologist will be involved with the whole process. That happens around the age of 9, 10, 11 for a natal, for someone who was born with female reproductive organs, and for a male it might happen a little later because puberty comes later. And after a trans young person is on a puberty blocker for a certain number of years, there are options for hormones. And I know that, Jay, you even teach about this, so I feel like my own kind of labored attempt to explain this, I should probably just turn it over to you. But those options will be given to Jacob if he wants them, because to me, I know that my child knows who he is, and who he genuinely is his mind, his soul, his heart, his being, and that is male. So if there's anything I can do to help him to make his physical sense, his physical body, be more appropriate to who he actually is, so that he can live a healthy, wholesome life, I'm 100% with that. Regardless of any inconvenience or cost, or some choices that he might have to make at some point, he will always have that option from us. And that next option would be hormones. It would be testosterone, and so that might come at around the age of 13 and 14. And Jay, I think I should let you take it away.
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of misinformation out in the media that says like young trans kids are being medicalized, they're having surgery, they're doing all of this crazy stuff. Literally, the prescription for a 5-year-old trans kid that like comes to the conference is like, oh, you know what? They really want a haircut. Like, all right, or they want to grow their hair long, or they want to wear a dress, or they want to wear, I don't know, football clothes. Like, so the idea of a young child transitioning and having it be like this big extraordinary, not that it's not a big extraordinary event, because it's really big for that child, but in the grand scheme of things, it's 90% of the time it's like, oh, okay, you can wear dresses and we're going to call you this name and these pronouns. So in young children, up until the onset of puberty, they just live like any other kid. They get dressed the same way any other kid does, in clothes that make them feel comfortable. They start using a name that affirms them, makes them feel happy. And that is the transition, like in and of itself for a child. At the onset of puberty, kids are typically offered blockers unless they don't want them. And they stop the clock. They don't have any negative side effects as far as reproductivity. Like people have, like there's no long-term adverse effects, but it hits the pause button so that these kids have a little bit more time. And then from there, they can choose to start cross-sex hormones, or they can choose that they don't want to. And there's no like one size fits all. Families and trans people and non-binary people really do what's best for them, what works for them, what's healthy for them. Like Mimi said, for Jacob, probably much like myself, he'll probably have a pretty standard, if things are the way he wants, he already socially transitioned, he would start hormone blockers, and then they would titrate his testosterone the same way testosterone would titrate in a natal male. And same thing for the reciprocal. They would titrate estrogen the same way that natal puberty would occur. So other than this like change with the blockers, the kids now, I mean, I didn't have blockers when I was a kid, but the kids now go through pretty regular puberty. All right, let's see. I know Arthur wanted to ask a quick question, so I just want to encourage him just to unmute whenever he's ready.
Thank you very much, Jay. And Mimi, I want to share this with the congregation and people who are listening. I heard about your appearing, and I went out and I got the book, and I bought the book. And then I had the opportunity to get it and listen to it rather than read it. And I want to tell everybody, your words are so beautiful. Her story is amazing, but the writing is incredible. And to hear her telling the story has just blown me away. And I think it's absolutely wonderful. And I want to tell everybody also, if they want to see Jacob, we found by accident his conversation with Elizabeth Warren, and it's on YouTube. And everybody, you will not believe it. This young man he's so adorable. I'm a gay man who was married. I went the other way, and I have grandchildren and children, and it's just wonderful. I wish you the best. I thank you for the book. Your words are beautiful.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Thank you so much. And I'm agreeing with you on Jacob. I shep so much nachas when I see that video. He was so poised. He had an opportunity to ask Elizabeth Warren during a Democratic debate. So between the different Democratic candidates, I don't know if it was a debate. It was more like a town hall. And he had an opportunity to ask her what she would do for trans kids like him in schools to make them feel safer. And she said the first thing she would do is get rid of Betsy DeVos. And so we may not have Elizabeth Warren, but we have accomplished that. But she didn't leave without reiterating that trans kids should not be protected in schools. So anyway, you know where I stand on that. But thank you, Arthur. Thank you so much.
Awesome. And our next question is, do you worry about Jacob eventually leaving this area and encountering a lack of acceptance?
Yeah, of course I do. Yeah. And, I think that's every parent's nightmare. No matter who your kid is, even if they're not trans, you worry, our kids are all different in some way, frequently. And, You want them to succeed in life. You want them to love and be loved. And that's all I want for my kid. Thankfully, I see some signs of some pretty strong, resilient ability in him. And he has had some, I would say it's never mild. I feel bad calling it mild, but some bullying, which was not extreme, but in his school, some kids said things to him. He felt, he felt the pain of it, and he was insecure for a while about it, by which I mean 2 or 3 weeks, and he bounced back and he offered to speak to the school about what it meant to be trans. So to me, that is so encouraging. I feel like if he continues to have an ability to speak, to share his own story, and to feel empowered, and to know that he's making a difference for other kids, the hate he encounters will he'll be able to put it in context, that this is why I'm doing what I do, this is why I'm speaking, and I'm better, I'm bigger than this, and that's what I'm hoping for him. But of course, you worry. There's this year has had some record violence, particularly against trans women of color, and some of them were very young, and lost their lives in horrific ways, because of lack of acceptance and because of hatred. And so we have a lot of work to do to make sure that not only Jacob, who comes from such a privileged background, but that all transgender young people can go out into the world and feel safe.
Couldn't agree more. The next question we have is, were you and your husband usually on the same page with the ways in which you handled Jacob's journey?
Yeah. So I was very lucky to be able to say yes. So I was a stay-at-home mom during this time, so I got to witness a lot more of Jacob's unhappiness and his subsequent happiness. So for me, it was very, I was kind of like the bell ringer to my husband. I was like, something's going on. But he has a wonderfully a stoic nature. He takes things in stride. He believes what he sees and researches it, which I love, rather than turn to, an emotional response might have been, I don't want my kid to be trans. But thankfully, in his case, he said, okay, let me learn more about this. And I think that was just the right response. And so he did some research. We didn't find anything about very young kids, but we found some videos, and actually a TEDx talk that had been given by the man who started the gender clinic in Boston Children's. And he looked into the science of it and he said, this is very possible. But at that time, we still didn't know that Jacob was within the age frame that a transition made sense. But we came to that understanding just by looking at our child together and seeing how unhappy he was, and realizing, in my husband's words, that it was not worth the risk of forcing Jacob to live as something he was not for another year and another year after that, just so that we could satisfy that it wasn't some kind of phase. He said, well, if he just changes his mind, well, then that's the worst thing that can happen, is that we kind of get a little egg on our face as parents. But what's the worst thing that can happen if we don't transition him young? And that was, in my husband's thinking, a much worse eventuality.
All right. The next one I have, can you clarify the meaning of non-binary, and were you surprised when Eli came out as non-binary?
A little bit. But again, puberty is one of those milestones that frequently brings to the surface or crystallizes struggles that a child might have had for a while. And then puberty comes, and sometimes, in the words of another advocate friend of mine, there's this last ditch effort to make yourself conform, to make your, to your sex assigned at birth. And then you kind of, at puberty, you kind of realize this isn't going to work. And so in Eli's case, it's in some ways more complicated, in some ways less complicated than with Jacob. I was surprised. Eli was presenting typically female up until a certain point, maybe 10 or 11 years old, um, and then became kind of more into anime and kind of like they started to move away from dolls and more kind of like what you say, typical stereotypically female presentations. But even then it just felt like they were, it did kind of take me by surprise. But I know that this journey is Eli's journey. It is not my journey. I don't get to tell them when they reach the realization that they would like to be affirmed with different pronouns, which is basically at this point that's all that they have asked of us is they, them, their pronouns and the name Eli. And to not refer to them as a girl, just to refer to them as a sibling or a child or a wonderful person, which is what they are. And so to go back to the definition of non-binary, gender, as we understand gender, just as we, as a world, as a human civilization, have come to understand things about our physical earth that we did not know years ago. It is not flat, for example. We now have a better understanding of gender. We know it's on a spectrum, like many other things in humanity and in our lives. There's not always a black or white. And so in that gray area where you don't particularly feel that a masculine identity is what you're experiencing, or a completely feminine identity, that middle would be non-binary. And people experience non-binary in different ways. Sometimes they experience it fluidly, where there are periods of time when they feel more masculine, more feminine, neither, both. And then there are people who feel solidly non-binary, for what that's worth. That's not a contradiction in terms, even though it sounds like it, where, I am pretty sure I'm not either male or female. So let's just consider me in the middle here. And with Eli, they're enjoying, at least in their expression, which is, the way you express your gender. We all express our gender. I'm expressing my gender with long hair, makeup, certain type of clothing. That's the way I express myself, the things I'm interested in, but again, that's cultural, the way we express gender. So the way Eli is enjoying expressing their gender is a mix. It's a blend. There are days when they feel like they want to wear like the bigger flannel shirts and the oversized jeans, and they just kind of exude a more masculine vibe. And then there are times when they love putting on makeup and earrings, and that's their exploration. And as long as they're happy and healthy, which they appear to be, then that is all that I need to be concerned about.
Perfect. And in adding to the discussion around non-binary people, I know we haven't brought up intersex people.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Intersex people are born with any type of abnormality that can be related to hormones or sexual function, secondary sex characteristics. Intersex births are actually 1 in 1,000 births. They're about 10 times more common than red hair. So as we continue to research non-binary and trans folks, we're finding out that not only is like gender identity being a part of exploration, there's a lot of biological foundation to these identities. So I did want to include that a little bit because I know we didn't really speak to that. And I do realize that we're about 5 minutes over. So I do want to say, if anybody has to jump, I won't be offended, but if Mimi is open to it, she's welcome to finish up the rest of the questions in the chat. And yeah.
Thank you.
Mimi,
and one more thing, Jay. Not only, are we discovering that there's so many differences in, the biological makeup of the reproductive organs, but there are also different chromosomes have there's like 150 variations on the XY chromosome. You can have an XXY or an XXYY. So there's definitely a lot of variety in nature, which is not something that you'll hear people who kind of have anti-trans mentality or have been kind of drinking that Kool-Aid will not necessarily know about when you hear people say, well, there's only XX and there's only XY and that's it, and pick one. That's actually not true. There's just such a tremendous and beautiful variation in human nature on chromosomes, on in reproductive organs.
Absolutely. Let's see. How do you explain to other young children? Does Jacob explain to friends, or friends have always understood Jacob as male?
So when he first came out, he was just, we didn't, that was before we started advocating. The first few months in his school, he went to a new school and he just preferred to, be known as Jacob. And he was kind of, I would say that was the period where he was kind of getting his feelers and feeling comfortable with himself. And, he had to tell people sometimes, hey, can you call me Jacob now instead of my former name? But he didn't have to do that a lot in his new school. So he just coasted kind of as who he is. Now he has those discussions as he gets older and he does more advocacy. He's more interested in the advocacy. People, some friends have seen him. They've seen him on TV. They've seen the NBC piece we did. And he's had those discussions with friends and they've been by and far pleasant. He said sometimes they make silly assumptions and he has a comeback. He said, what did he say the other day? He said, if anyone, tells me that I can't pick my gender, I'll say something like, oh, that nice gender, is that the one your mom picked out for you? Anyways, I thought that was a pretty good comeback. So he is taking it in stride. He has some of those conversations, but he doesn't walk up to a new kid in school and say, hi, my name is Jacob and I'm a trans boy. So it's part of his identity that he is an advocate, but the bigger part of his identity is that he's just a 10-year-old boy who likes hedgehogs and drama.
Yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind is that these kids are so resilient that they take it in stride in ways that marvel me. As an adult and as a trans person, I know even coming out, even like among friends, can be scary. And a lot of times it's pretty amazing how these kids are able to navigate it and have fun with it. And then in talking with really young kids, I transitioned in my very early teens and my aunt had 2 sons and she was so worried. She's like, what are you going to tell them? And I was like, the truth. But they were 3 and 5 and we were like sitting on the floor. And I just remember, telling Caden and Colton, I was like, I'm going to use the name Jay now, and boy pronouns. And they were like, oh yeah, we already knew that. Can we go back to playing cars now? And I was like, all right. And that's pretty much that was the conversation. They didn't have any questions. They were way more worried about the Matchbox cars on the rug than they were about what was going on with me. So I think sometimes a lot of that fear among other kids or explaining things to young kids is a little bit overblown.
Yeah. And one way I've described it, which is kind of simplistic, but it's what I told Jacob's siblings at, around the time of his transition, is that Jacob is a boy in his heart and in his mind. And so that's what really counts. And so we're going to treat him as he knows himself to be, as he truly is, because he would be pretty upset if we didn't. And so that was enough for them.
That's awesome. And then one of the last questions I saw in the chat was asking, do you support trans children attending therapy or support groups through their transition?
I think that's wonderful if those are affirming support groups, and the therapy is affirming, meaning that the person who is giving the therapy understands, what it means to be trans. That, they don't have to be trans. It's always a positive thing if you can find somebody, but understands and does not look on the phenomenon of being transgender in a negative light, because that will set them up to, not be supportive of your kid, and that could be potentially dangerous for a young person to be exposed to that. But somebody who is playing the role of therapist, is supportive, letting your child lead in terms of those discussions about gender, would probably be the best fit. So I absolutely think that's important for a kid to have access to that. And in terms of support groups like PFLAG, which is Parents for Lesbian and Gay Young People, including transgender people these days. PFLAG groups are great. There's in Massachusetts, we have something called NAGLY and AGLY, which is another kind of all the acronyms for these support groups. I'm sure there's something out in Rhode Island, and I'm sure Jay knows all about it. And I'm pretty sure you have your own support group. So yes, absolutely. Yes. Support groups.
Yeah, they can be a lot of fun too. We have a good time with the kids.
I bet that most of the fun has nothing to do with gender. It's just
No.
yeah.
Well, from being at Family Fun Weekend, like, it's not a weekend if the kids don't have on 15 different types of clothes covered in glitter and are running through the hallways. So, all right, we have a question here. You spoke about your feelings of loss in the beginning. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So it's a complicated topic, because I never want my son to feel that his transition was a negative experience. Because in truth, him becoming the best version of himself, the person he was meant to be, was an absolutely beautiful experience in hindsight. But the fear beforehand of, what he would go through in life, would people mistreat him? And also that sense of the person that I knew as a girl. I was incorrect, but that's the person I knew. So when he transitioned and I had to reframe my entire thinking about him as my son, there were a few months where, particularly it was before the transition, when I knew it was pending, and before I saw his happiness, where I felt like I was going to lose a daughter. And this is a common feeling that parents go through. I'm glad I didn't share that with him, though, because I wouldn't want him to ever think that him becoming him was a bad thing, because it never was. But I had to let go of some preconceived notions about who he was and the kind of future we would have together as a mother and daughter. And so naturally there was a sense of loss, but that was pretty soon replaced with, the wonder, the excitement of having the son. It was like a birth, but it was this kid and I didn't have to change his diapers. It was beautiful. And I got to see him grow into his own skin and just become that happy kid that he was meant to be. And so that very soon replaced that feeling of loss. But we are funny beings, humans, and I'll come across an old photo because I didn't realize it was, not obviously, I don't have photos up anymore, but I'll come across an old photo, in my computer files or something, and I'll be like, oh, and there's this little tug in my heart, and that's humanity. We are complicated beings, and memory and the way we think about each other and feel about each other is a very strong pull. And just like, you can smell something and you're brought back into a moment in your childhood. I can see a picture and I'm brought back into a moment where in this alternate reality, there was somebody I knew of as a daughter. And so those feelings are complicated. And I think parents going through that need to have compassion for themselves, to understand that it doesn't make them transphobic to have these feelings, but those feelings need to be something they discuss with other adults in their life, or with a therapist, or with a spouse. And in, at some point we need to be able to see our children for who they really are. And this goes for kids who surprise us big by becoming goth too, like, or something like that. The real child in front of you needs to be celebrated. And if we're not letting go of that feeling of the intense grief, then we might need to question, are we resistant in some way to our children's identity? But that is something that typically doesn't happen. And with the parents I know, the grief starts to ebb, and and you get to see your kid become who they really are. I hope that's helpful.
That was beautiful. Mimi, thank you so much for speaking, for sharing your story, for being open, for being a fierce advocate.
Thank you.
You really are such a blessing. And with that, I will turn you back over to Rabbi Mack.
Jay, thank you as well for facilitating such a beautiful conversation. Mimi, we're so grateful to have you with us today. And I want to remind everyone, we have copies of Mimi's book in the Temple office. So if you would like to swing by and claim a copy, it is beautiful. And we are just thrilled to be able to help you share your narrative and your story. We're really grateful that you could be with us today. And I also want to introduce Jody Glass and Ruthie Horton. Jody is our Pride Team co-chair. And to wrap us up, I'm going to invite Jody to tell us a little bit about the Pride Team, because this is the one of many events. And I also saw, if she's still with us, Stephanie Haig at some point. And again, I wanted to say thank you to the Alliance. We're grateful to partner always.
I think Stephanie had to go
did she have to go? Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we shared our gratitude. It's always good to have community partners as well.
Yes.
So Jody, take it away.
Okay, well, first of all, this book, we fought over it because it was, well, I can sit here and stammer, but the journey of it, the parallel that you drew was just the idea of identity, and the respect that I have for you. It's just grown this evening, and your authenticity is just too much. I thank you so much. Your children are blessed,
Yes.
as are you.
Thank you. I'm blessed to have them and to be able to be here tonight. So thank you.
Well, I wrote when somebody asked if you attend a temple that is LGBTQ friendly, I suggest that you visit ours.
I would love that. Oh, get me out of this house. First of all. Secondly,
Bring
yes,
everybody.
I will. Yes, I will. I will get down there by hook or by crook. I love Rhode Island, and
Well, you're welcome. I'm opening that invitation.
And you always have a place to stay.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. And I will bring my pug to see your pug, and so
Yes.
that's another thing we have in common.
Well, I know that what's coming up for us is that one of our fabulous groups in the community is Youth Pride, and we service children from, actually one of the newer groups is Young Unicorns, Little Unicorns. And that's for little young trans kids and also LGBTQ kids, 5 to 9. And so what we're doing is helping with their pantry. And we're going to wait until I think about April, that'll be happening. And that's probably going to be our next project. And of course, we don't know what's up for Pride yet, but we'll be there depending on what's going on. But we're overflowing with love and support for what you brought us tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank
We'll
you
do this again.
for bringing me here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jay.